So I've seen some Reddit threads talking about meta changes, and I want to talk a little bit about how the overarching playstyle in professional Overwatch has changed. So quickly after the game came out, we saw players fall into this rough role structure, with the main tank, the flex support, and so on. And the flex supports, we're mostly talking about the Zen and the Ana here, are really, really strong. Their potential for heals, damage, and utility is so insane that teams were forced on this fundamental level to really focus on playing around them. Whoever's flex support had better LOS on the fight gave their team a massive advantage that really can't be understated. This foundation of setting up your support while taking down their enemies gives birth to a lot of these emergent playstyles that I've talked about already. Setting up a strong side to give them a rotation structure, insulating them in a way that lets them help the team play for map control, all that stuff. And regardless of the heroes we were actually seeing, this was generally the main focus of both teams, and it gave them a lot of options. Sometimes teams would lean more towards pushing aggressively to deny enemy support LOS. Other teams would really focus on baiting in and catching engages using their own support LOS. But then the meta starts to change, and sure, this was enabled by balance patches and new heroes, and that does get talked about a lot, but it's also important to understand the playstyle change that came along with it. Because now, instead of using the flex support to play around and force fights, teams really started abusing the objective. If we look at GOATs, enabled by the shields, matrix, and sustain, teams were able to transition to point and stack the objective, where they're able to use their ability to avoid almost all incoming damage to keep that capture pressure up and force a contest from the enemy team. At that point, they can abuse the other thing they're really good at and start a brawl with the enemy tank line. In the past, we've seen comps try this and lose to being surrounded and poked down from multiple angles. Pharah's always played a core role here, or they'll lose to being surrounded, engaged on, and blown up by dive comps. But through a combination of balance patches and teams really embracing the power of the objective, those counters became really inefficient. Trying to engage or dive onto those teams requires so much brawl potential you'll probably just get annihilated. And since these comps aren't even that weak to poke, it takes time and ultimates to even have a chance of winning the fight using that style. Time during which that stacked up team is forcing the objective and making your team contest or lose the point. And regardless of comp, the meta playstyle has kept moving in this direction, with it steadily becoming more and more difficult to poke down or build ults versus these types of comps before they win through the objective. Now, even on control maps where teams have a lot of time before they're forced to contest, and so where historically we've always seen a dive or poke based counter to these comps, role lock and the introduction of Sigma have made this almost impossible, as you can't run triple DPS, and Sigma's shield is so effective at negating the alternate angles those poke comps need to be able to win those fights. Again, in that short time frame they have before the stacked up team is able to force an objective contest. There's obviously a lot of reasons that these types of comps are popular, but this playstyle change is really a driving force in how teams are approaching the game at the moment, and it's something I haven't really seen people talk about when they're theory crafting. Teams are playing a comp that's resistant to poke, using it to transition to point and force the objective, and using the enemy's contest to drag them into a brawl they can't win. By using the strength of the objective to make that brawl inevitable, teams force comp switches away from dive and poke based comps into more brawl-centered comps that are better suited to this playstyle of forcing the objective that looks like it's here to stay.